Today we're going to look at discussion, interpersonal communication, part 4, specifically the world of words or verbal communication. One of the things that we need to pay attention to when we look at verbal communication is that our verbal communication is language. And we speak, at least in this class, in English. Now, in our next discussion, when we get to nonverbal communication in particular, we'll talk about rate, pitch, volume, guttural utterances, etc. But right, this particular discussion, we want to focus on the language itself, or the articulation of the words. Language is in and of itself very symbolic. Symbolism means what? That the symbol stands for a reference, stands for something else. And the very nature of symbols, we want to specifically cover 3 major characteristics. The first is that symbols are arbitrary. Arbitrary means that it's not constrained by necessity, or I might otherwise suggest that there is no intrinsic value between the word and the referent, whatever that word is referring to. For example, this, as I hold it up, we might call it a pen. But if we decided to call it something else, does that change the very nature of what this is? The answer to that question is no. The function could very well still be the same. So if we all decide suddenly that we're going to call this an apple, what is it? It's an apple. If there were an intrinsic connection between the word and the referent, meaning, no, this is a pen. We all know it's a pen. It's got to be a pen. In fact, you know, there's that intrinsic connection at the cosmic level between this and the word pen. Then around the globe we would all be speaking the exact same language. But we know that language to language to language, culture to culture to culture, there's a different word than pen for this item. Again, referring back to discussion 1, meanings are in people, they're not in words. Meanings lie in people, not in words. So the first characteristic of symbols that we want to discuss today is the idea that symbols are arbitrary. Somewhere we decided pen is the symbol for what this is right here. Okay, arbitrary. The second characteristic of language, specifically with respect to symbols, is that symbols are ambiguous. Arbitrary, ambiguous. Ambiguous means it's subject to multiple meanings. Because meanings are in people and not in words, the words themselves can have as many meanings as there are people. What do I mean by that? Think about this for a moment. If I say to you, it's a very blue day today. What does the word blue mean here? First, it might mean it's a very sad day. Something drastic happened and we're all sad, because there's a connotative meaning to the word blue that might suggest morose or sadness. I might say it's a very blue day today. And I'm looking out, the sun is shining, the skies are blue, the weather is perfect, and I'm using blue in a positive connotation. Now, if I look at the denotative definition of blue and look in the dictionary, I'm going to find a reference to a color, aren't I? A reference to a color in particular. So, when we start talking about definitions, we have, for example, denotative definitions you might translate as dictionary definitions or the literal definition of the word. And we have connotative definitions or personal meanings. And if meanings are in people and not in words, the concept of abstractness becomes more understandable to recognize that I might have very personal meanings to very different words. So when I'm speaking to somebody, is it possible to give a presentation, for instance, wherein I offend 0 people? Probably not. Because everybody is going to take a very different line of thought to the various words that you're going to say. And the mere choice of words is going to have various connotations to different people. So this is also why when we say, for example, that reporters strive to be objective in their words, is there such a thing as objectivity in news reporting? Probably not, because the mere fact that they have chosen certain words is in and of itself a reflection of meaning and their shade or characteristic or bent of meaning. When we talk about ambiguity, we might also talk about mixing definitions on purpose, might we? Politicians might do this all the time. You are going to vote for me if you are a politician. I'm sorry, if you are a patriot. Not a politician, I'm talking about politicians. You're going to vote for me if you are a patriot. What in the world does that mean? Patriotism. Patriotism. We're talking about patriotism when we talk about words that stand for ideas, groups of people, events, objects, feelings, and so forth, but they could be very distinctly different. Right? What am I talking about here? Abstractness. The third characteristic of symbols. Arbitrary, we decide on something. We decide what it's going to be. We called it a pen, we decided. Ambiguous, meanings are in people, they're not in words. We might have multiple definitions. If we have multiple definitions, then the third characteristic that flows here is the idea of abstractness. It allows us to talk about things that are not concrete. If I talk about the table in the room, I can put my hands on it, I can touch it, it's concrete. If it's abstract, it might mean that I don't have the opportunity to touch it. But it also means that the definition might be going back a little bit to our ambiguity, ambiguousness, and arbitrariness. You're going to vote for me if you're a patriot. Patriotism is a very abstract concept. I can't touch patriotism. I can't touch love. I can't touch respect. But I have various definitions of the word. And for example, patriotism. Does that politician who says that want to define it as he or she believes it ought to be defined? Not in the slightest. And will refuse any opportunity to get backed into a corner to be pinned down with a definition. Because what I want to do if I'm a politician and I say something like, if you're a patriot, you will vote for me. I want to actually I want to stroke your feelings of patriotism, even if you feel that the definition of patriotism is very different, if not even opposite of what I think it is. I just want to cull your affection for the word and the feelings that might come across when I say you need to be a patriot here. We don't want to define it. And sometimes, so abstractness is sometimes used as a strategic tool. Okay. So what are the principles of verbal communication? The first, communication reflects cultural history. Communication, culture, and history reflect each other. Our language is born out of our experience. Meanings are in people, they're not in words. If language is born out of experience, our language reflects the experience. We had a conversation earlier about handwriting. That's a real cultural thing when you think about it. And the fact that technology is going to make obsolete the term penmanship, signatures, or change the definition of the word signature, but certainly make obsolete the definition of penmanship. So the language will reflect the culture and it will evolve with our history. The meanings of language are subjective. What are we saying here? What I've been saying all along. Meanings are in people, they're not in words. There are no concrete, very specific definitions of any word specific to anybody anywhere. I mean, we could talk about, oh, well, there are literal definitions of everything, but even the way they're stated. I want you to turn left at the next light. At what arc and degree are we specifically referring to? And what does it mean to actually turn left? Do I turn my body? Or do I take the vehicle and actually turn and go? Those definitions can change. So meanings of language are subjective. Language in and of itself, based on our culture, is rule guided. We have communication rules, which are what? Shared understandings of what communication means and what behaviors are appropriate in various situations. We don't go to a funeral in the Western culture happy and excited, wearing funny clown clothes and carrying balloons. And singing happy songs. At least in Western culture. There are a time and a place for various conversations, and appropriate conversations take place along certain lines. You're in a classroom now, for instance. There are conversations that are appropriate, and these conversations may not necessarily go over too well at the bar down the corner, but in the bar down the corner, you're going to have conversations that would not be appropriate in church or the classroom. There are regulative rules, communication rules that regulate interaction by specifying when, how, where, and with whom to talk about certain things. When do you approach your significant other about the fact that you wish to break up with them? We strategize that, don't we? We plan that. When do you approach a conversation with your boss about wanting a raise? This is all about regulative rules. When do you talk about going out to dinner? Or what to cook? There are also constitutive rules. Rules that define what communication means by specifying how certain communicative acts are to be counted. Why is this important? And most constitutive rules will answer that question. Why is this important, and how important is it? Somebody just walked down the hall, and what they said as they passed you sounded distinctly like an insult. What does that mean? How important is it? Well, it might be important depending on who it was. If it was somebody you know, then maybe it was very important. If it was somebody you've never met before, it may not be important at all, and we don't have to care. And the other principle of verbal communication we want to talk about is that punctuation shapes meaning. We are, by our very nature of being human beings, what Walter Fisher, communication theorist, has termed homo narrans. Homo narrans, which essentially mean people of the story. People of the story. Where we start and where we stop a story within our language has a tendency to change the entire perception of how that story is viewed by us and how we hope to send that view to others. Punctuation shapes meaning. I pursue you because you're running away from me. That's where the story starts for me. You keep pursuing me, so I keep running. That's where the story starts for the other. Why is this person chasing me? And you know, most arguments and quarrels that we have with someone, if you sit down and ask both parties, when did the argument, when did the fight, when did the quarrel start? Both sides will give you a completely different answer. Because both sides will often justify how they're responding because of something you did and not suggest they were the initial aggressor. But life is a long journey. And we make sense of it many times through stories. And we start and we end those stories where it makes sense for us. Walter Fisher said we are homo narrans, people of the story. And that is one of the things that perhaps defines us, especially when we start talking about our use of language. So when we start looking at the abilities of symbols, the abilities of language, we're going to look at the idea that language both defines, evaluates, it organizes perceptions, which I've already alluded to. It allows hypothetical thought, and it allows for self-reflection. Let's talk about the definition. Language defines. Like we just talked about with respect to stories. Am I the aggressor in an argument, quarrel, or complaint, or am I the responder? If I'm the responder, I'm seeking justice and I'm justified in my actions. If I'm the aggressor, perhaps I'm in the wrong. That's not something we normally as human beings like to believe or admit. And so I'm going to change the perception of my story and how I perceive things through the language that I use to discuss and talk about it, to put myself in a point where my rationale and my perception shows, if you buy it, whoever I'm talking to, shows that I am justified. So it shapes our perceptions. How about somebody that we like? How do we label them? We give them words and we talk about them to others in terms that make sense and that are positive. You know, that person is a little eccentric, but they're okay. But if I didn't like them, what would I say? You know what, that person's just a little bit too strange, maybe creepy for me. And we might be talking about the same actions and the same person, but different perceptions. So language allows us to shape our perception. Language also allows us to totalize, which is not a positive trait. We respond to a person as if one aspect of his or her life is the totality of that person. That can be a problem. You know, that person is unreliable. Well, that person may have been unreliable in this particular situation because this is what was going on in their life. But I've now totalized them, perhaps, and I've said, based on what I've seen, this person, generally speaking, is unreliable. Therein lies the problem. Because we totalize that person entirely as unreliable. Or that person is, you know, completely knowledgeable, that person is smart, that person knows everything. That person may not know everything. And as such, we're totalizing them, perhaps at their disadvantage as well. And language affects relationships. How do we define our experiences with another person? I can go on a picnic with my family and have a really good conversation, for example, with my grandmother, and believe that we are close. And I might describe that later as a very close conversation that I had with my grandmother. What if I didn't like my grandmother? I might describe that conversation later as my grandmother prying, getting too nosy, and even now characterizing the relationship that could have been characterized as my grandmother showing care and concern. Well, now I'm characterizing the relationship as she's nosy, she butts in, she interferes. It's a very big difference. How we frame the experiences we have with each other has a tendency to also define the relationship we have. Language evaluates. Language evaluates. We talked about it essentially reflecting and shaping our perceptions, where we tend to describe people we like with good terms and people we don't like in negative terms. Language can also be loaded. An extreme form of evaluative language. It relies on words that strongly slant perceptions. You know, if I use very strong, stereotypical words that might be considered insults to people or about people, I have a tendency then at that point to use loaded language, whether it's emotionally loaded, and it typically is if I'm using loaded language, or full of concepts and other ideas that go along with it, whether good or bad. We have a tendency to suggest things that go along with it, much like the implicit personality theory we talked about in earlier discussions. And language can also degrade others. You know, we can build people up, but we can tear them down. Language can do that. Think about it. I can see somebody in the morning who might have woken up thinking, what a great day. I can say something that might be really hateful. And when I do, that ruins the rest of their day. And they just threw them for a loop and they can't get over it. Because I've insulted them. The reverse can also be true, can't it? I might wake up in the morning and somebody's not feeling not so good, and somebody comes up to me and says something really kind, really complimentary, and all of a sudden that made my entire day. When children are in primary school, one of the ways they begin to learn from adults to argue and put others down is by name calling. That translates oftentimes into adulthood in forms of hate speech. When we see people somehow we don't agree with and we think they shouldn't exist, we have this ability to evaluate, to judge, and move into hate speech. Language can degrade others. And sometimes it's more effective to degrade or impactful to degrade than it is to build people up. It's much harder to build people up. Language, pardon me, language also organizes our perceptions. It allows for abstract thought. We're able to think about abstract concepts such as justice, integrity, love, respect, patriotism. And we don't have to consider the fact that I might be in a dark room that's quiet, and I can't see anything to suggest this is love. There's lots of things that I might try and talk about. Love is like. Justice is. But can I actually say this is exactly what it is and point to it and make someone else understand? No, they'll come up with a personal meaning, because meanings lie within people and not within words. They'll come up with a personal meaning of their own, and we hope that it's something similar to ours. But essentially, the fact that we're capable of abstract thought allows us to think beyond what we see. Language can also stereotype. Stereotypes, when discussed, are often discussed as something bad. You know, if I ask, oh, are stereotypes good or bad? Everyone's going to raise their hand and say, oh, no, they're bad. Why? Because when we see or talk about examples of stereotyping, we often hear about it in terms of hate speech. This entire group of people, however we want to label them, and then we throw insults. Can stereotypes be good? I think they can. And I think, in fact, because the mind, we as human beings, do not care that much for uncertainty. And we like to have some idea of how people are going to respond around us, even if we don't know them and we haven't met them yet. Oftentimes, we stereotype as a tool that helps us navigate society. It keeps us sometimes from going crazy. The unhealthy part of that is when we stick to our stereotypes, even when someone proves that they are already unique enough to grow beyond the stereotype that we have ascribed to them. That's where the danger comes into. We don't want to stereotype and end there. But if we use stereotypes, positive ones, about what we think we know about people, to try and help our uncertainty levels come down some, then what we are doing is trying to approximate their worldviews based on what we think, what little we know about them already, and allow our definitions to continue to expand as we get to know who they are. So yes, language can also stereotype, but that is also a very serious, as a tool that can be dangerous. Language also allows hypothetical thought. We can think beyond the immediate concrete situation. It allows us to think in 3 dimensions of time. The past, the present, and the future. If I can think about the past, I can think about where I've been. I can make plans, therefore, for the future based on where I am now, where I want to be. And we can also foster personal growth as a result of this. What do I mean by that? I can foster personal growth as a result of this because I can look into my past, see what I did or didn't like about my past, and about how I acted and my responses to various things. Examine where I am today as a result of having gone through the experiences of my past, and then use language, essentially, as the tool by which I'm going to design the thought pattern for how I wish to respond in the future and grow as a result. So we can foster personal growth out of this. And the same holds true for language allowing self-reflection. That whole looking into the past, that whole looking at my current self, it's all about self-reflection, isn't it? I'm able to monitor my communication while I'm having it. I may look at somebody and I may start talking with somebody and then I may realize that they've got this pained look on their face. I've been monopolizing the conversation, and because I'm recognizing a pained look on their face, at that point I might want to stop and say, hey, wait a minute. I've missed something. What's going on with you? Because I'm monitoring the fact that I've monopolized the conversation, because I'm monitoring what's going on around me, I can recognize that maybe something I said really hurt them, or maybe there's something else going on in their life, in their minds, about what I said specifically that triggered something that they needed to discuss a little bit more. Language, or self-reflection, also allows us to manage our image, doesn't it? Do you talk a certain way when you go on a job interview? Do you specifically choose certain language when you walk into a classroom as you're speaking? Are you looking to manage a particular image that you have about yourself while you're at work so that others get the image that you're hoping to portray? Do you portray a specific image when you're out socializing compared to when you're at church, compared to when you're at work? Language allows us to manage the image we're hoping to portray to others. language is also something that is communal, right? It happens between people. I communicate through language. I not only communicate to myself and with myself, I communicate with others. The more I spend time with others, you might remember from our first discussion, we talked about the shared field of experiences get wider and wider as we begin to share those experiences. And we might remember that we talked about that every conversation I have with someone is a continuation of every conversation I've ever had with someone. Because of the shared field of experiences and the onset of shared meanings and the ability to reference previous encounters. We develop within certain communities certain ways of saying things. This happens within a family. This happens within a small community. It happens within a region. It might be idioms. It might be the way the word specific that we use. It might be the fact that I'm referring to something in particular here that they call it something completely different elsewhere. I immediately think of, for example, the term soda and the term pop and the term Coke. All three of those refer to the same thing depending on where you are in the country. Being a northerner, when I came here to southern Kentucky, for instance, there were a couple things that it took me a little while to get used to. And the first we talked about already, when I handed some paperwork to someone and I said, would you mind copying this for me in preparation for my first class? And the person who I handed it to looked at me and says, I don't care to. I immediately took the stack of papers back and left. She came back to me later and said, where are you going? And I said, well, if you aren't going to do it, I'll go find someone else to do it, or I'll do it myself. And she looked really confused and looked like I was crazy. And she said to me, what? I just said I'd do it. The words I don't care mean something very different in this part of the country as opposed to another part of the country. The words, for example, bless your heart, can mean a whole myriad of things depending upon the inflection and context in which it's said. Now, when I was teaching in Saudi Arabia, the same thing happens. They have a phrase in Arabic, for example, which, when translated, means, if God wills it. Words, meaning lies within people, not within words. So when I was talking to students over there, if I talk, well, let me go back. Normally, if you ask an adult in Saudi Arabia, for instance, who was good to their word, and you said, would you do this for me? And they would say the words in Arabic that meant, if God wills it. What that meant, meanings are in people, they're not in words. What that meant to that person was, it is my intention to do it. I will do my best to accomplish what I've said I will do. And the only reason it won't get done is God will intervene. Something is really going to have to happen that's going to be serious to keep me from keeping my word. Okay. Now, meanings are in people, they're not in words. If you ask your typical student that I dealt with in Saudi Arabia, are you going to do your homework? And they would say the words in Arabic translated to, if God wills it. And based on constant history, day in and day out, and they would keep coming back with the fact that they didn't do their homework. We began to realize that when they said in Arabic, if God wills it, what they meant to say was completely opposite of what the typical Saudi citizen, adult, who would say this to us. What they meant to say, when meanings are in people and not in words, what they meant to say was this: I have no intention of doing my homework, but if somehow God does my homework, I'll take credit for it. So as you can see, the words, how we say and what we say, might actually mean different things to different communities that I talk to. Let's talk about speech communities with respect to gender. Now think about this for a moment. We live in the West of the world, not the country, but we live in the West. Western culture, generally speaking, now I'm going to speak in some generalities here, and let me go ahead and put the disclaimer on the table. This does not apply to every single individual in this room or whoever listens to this talk. Okay, generally speaking in the West, boys in the West are raised from a very small age to do what? Play with toys. What toys? Toys that might be competitive, sports equipment that shows individual achievement, or if working with a team, to crush another team. Do boys play with dolls? Yeah, but we call them soldiers. We call them heroes. And what are their purpose? To destroy other heroes or soldiers. Conquest. They wind up getting tools. And learn oftentimes how to use those tools to build, to do individual achievement activities. Okay. So, what happens compared to girls? In the West, girls are given what? Tea sets, stuffed animals, dolls, kitchen toys as tools, makeup. And generally speaking, what do girls do with those things? They sit around and they place the tea set, for example, out on a table. They sit the dolls around the table, and they themselves then begin to have what? Conversation. What does this produce by the time that these individuals become adults? It produces women who are masters at the art of small talk and conversation. It produces men whose skills often range that when conversation is had, it's about problems, conquests, things that need to be solved, decided, conquered, or fixed. When you're talking with your stuffed animals around a tea set, you're going to talk about your feelings, about what happened in the day, about what you think is going on outside. When boys are talking, they're talking about strategy. You do this and that, we're going to make this play, run this particular play, you go this way, I go this way, and hopefully we'll make a score. Whatever that score is, however it's obtained. By the time they become adults, and men and women perhaps get together, what happens? Women want to share their feelings, men want to give them the answer. Women didn't want the answer, men don't want to have their feelings shared. Because it's not the way they were raised. Is it any wonder that men and women have relationships that are successful at all? So when we start talking about speech communities, we're not only talking about geographical regions, hobbies. People that are all gathered around a particular hobby. They have language that's associated with that hobby. Work jargon. People have language that's associated with their work. Communities, geography, online communities specific to why they're getting together online. Or gender communities that are also within various cultures. And this has a tendency to also talk about the kind of adults we wind up with. And so when we start thinking about how is language used, it's not so simple as to suggest that language is just this tool that I need to master, and here we go. When you learn a language, you learn an awful lot about the culture and the various cultures that speak it. This is also why English, people who learn English whose first language is not English, they're actually to be admired, because that is learning a new language of any kind is an incredible skill if people are actually spend the time to become proficient, because they're actually spending the time to learn an awful lot about the culture too, and how the culture operates. So how do we improve verbal communication? How do we improve the use of our language? First thing I would suggest is to engage in a dual perspective. Can I see things through your eyes? Can I recognize things from your perspective? It doesn't mean I have to agree with you, but it means I am able to see things as you can see them, as you do see them. And I've spent the time to truly listen and try to understand what you're trying to communicate to me so that I can get your point of view. Own your feelings and your own thoughts. Now, this is one of those things that really drives me personally insane. When somebody comes up to me and wants to say to me, "Oh, you make me," fill in whatever you want after that phrase. So angry, so excited, whatever it might be. My question is always, why are you giving me that power? Why would you, through your language, grant me so much power over you as to allow me to make you anything? By the simple words that we use, we give up our own power. It's important to pay attention to I language versus you language, because this might also be the track upon which abuse can start. Because handing someone that power over you, if you really want them to have it, you also wind up suffering the consequences of what they might do with it. So I language, take personal responsibility for your feelings with your words, and don't project responsibility for your feelings onto somebody else. I guarantee you that's going to be a larger cause of greater arguments and quarrels in any relationship. Respect what others say about their feelings and thoughts. You shouldn't feel that way. You don't really have the right to be angry about this. Really? You're trying to tell somebody, and we often get caught in that trap, where we hear other people saying those same things. We often like to tell somebody that they need to feel the same way we feel about it. Well, that's disrespectful. And they will feel disrespected. Give people the freedom to feel what they're going to feel, to think what they're going to think. That's the whole purpose of you trying to have a dual perspective in the first place. So respect what others say about their feelings and about their thoughts. Strive for accuracy and clarity. We already talked about abstraction. Abstraction can be a tool in which we want people not to have a good, clear definition. That's not usually the case in relationships. When we're in a relationship with anyone, we want as clear of an understanding between each other as we can possibly get. And when abstraction starts, seek clarity. What do you exactly mean by that? It may be they haven't given it enough thought to articulate exactly what they mean by that. Remember, of course, timing being everything, in some respects, especially a relationship between a man and a woman. A woman is a master at the art of talking about their feelings and often their thoughts. Men are not trained that way, generally speaking, in Western culture. And so if they're going to get along, they need some latitude and time to actually articulate. And think about how they want to articulate what it is they were going to articulate. So, something to pay attention to. Qualified generalizations. Look at the quality of the language. Qualified generalizations. So we don't mislead ourselves or others into mistaking a general statement for an absolute one. Avoid totalizing. Avoid stereotyping with individuals that you know uniquely. As you get to know someone personally, there should be no reason to be stereotyping at all. There should be no reason to totalize. It's a very dangerous dangerous practice to get into for our own relationship success. Be careful about static evaluations. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people have a tendency to quit the town that they grew up in and decide to move to someplace else is because they've been trapped in what we might call a static evaluation. Something about something that they did, whether they did it on purpose, whether it was an accident, whether it was something that they appreciate, or whether it was something that they didn't appreciate having had happened to them, or that they engaged in, or a mistake they made, all of a sudden becomes the total definition of who they are in that community by everyone else, and somehow they're not allowed to grow in other people's perceptions. That's probably one of the leading causes of why people move from where they grew up. Because if they move to some place where others don't know them, they are given the opportunity for growth. And to be somebody who they think they are, or be recognized more as somebody who they think they are, rather than the image from 20, 30 years ago that other people won't let go of. Okay, so that's what we wanted to talk about with respect today and language, verbal communication. Discussion 5, we're going to get into nonverbal communication. But with this discussion, we want to talk specifically about language, and it's important primarily to have a really good understanding that A, language is all about symbolism. The 3 characteristics of symbols are that they are abstract, arbitrary, and ambiguous. And get a good handle on what that means for how we communicate, especially when, as I've said many, many times, meanings lie within people, they don't lie within words. And as we strive to understand the meanings within people, we need to understand what it means to speak in symbolic form.